Hi everyone. What I'm going to do is put together another pair of videos and to move on to work through the second text leading to the second submission, and this is going to be by Fred Everett Morse. So we'll get to that in a moment. What I'm going to do first of all is review the questions from the Nattier article. So I'll just go through a few of them. Maybe it was covering an entire article, but a few things weren't quite picked up ideally. So question one, three types of extrinsic referral that Nattier thinks are appropriate to music. It refers outside itself, and these are spatiotemporal, kinetic, and affective. So spatiotemporal, kinetic, and affective. So question two, does Nattier, following Abate, believe that music has a past tense? No, he doesn't. He doesn't believe, like Abate doesn't believe, that music has a past tense. The quotation from Adorno in question three, speaking of Mahler, the correct answer there was a narrative which relates nothing. So short quotation from Adorno showing his sense of narrative as being something to qualify. He says, no, music is a narrative which relates nothing. Question four, that's fine. Question five, Nattier asserts two further conditions by which plot construction is enabled. And what are these? Well, he says that two objects as a minimum must be provided, and they must be placed in a linear or temporal association. Okay, so that's what I was looking for, question five. Two objects in a linear or temporal association. Question six, does he think that thematic identification or thematic audition is important to try and form a narrative impression in music? And he said no, at least as far as the listener's response to Sorcerer's Apprentice was concerned. They didn't pick up on the leitmotifs other than very weakly. So really no is the answer to question six. Question seven, does he think that narrative is therefore intrinsic to music? No, he doesn't. He thinks it's imagined and constructed by listeners. More on this when we get to Morse. Question eight. Yeah, I think everyone struggled with this. What term does Nattier introduce to characterize the way that music mimics the syllabic patterning of language? And really there he's thinking the rise and fall by which we musicalize language. Of course, some languages are strongly intonational. English is, and it follows a kind of sense of where is the point of this sentence or these group of sentences going, so we sort of musicalize the sense of contour, but it was intonation contour or intonation curve that we were looking for there. Question 10 then. Yeah, it's a German word that we were looking for, drawn from Jean-Paul, the idea of there being structure underneath a chaotic surface. It's a short word, it was Witz, W-I-T-Z, rather than Zeitgeist, which is a German word but is not the word that was appropriate in this particular situation. So the word there was Witz. That's Jean-Paul's idea that Schumann takes over through his own compositional techniques of musical realization of this concept of Witz. Okay, so those are those questions, and I'm going to put, 10 more questions in the course of a couple of videos. So this is the first and then another short one to follow, but there'll be another 10 questions. So I'll slot 6 into this video and then there'll be 4 in the following one. So let's pick up with Morse's article, and it's called Classical Instrumental Music and Narrative, and it was published in 2005. So it begins on page 466. And his focus, the author's focus, is purely instrumental music, so music with no text, and not programmatic either for that matter, so purely instrumental music with no explicit text or program. He says that the credibility of any claim to comprehend it in a narrative vein may be still, for some people, controversial. He says his view is that you can do so by analogy, rather than assume that a narrative substructure is actually present in the music, that in other words it's an immanent force in the music. No, he says it's relatable by analogy. And he continues by noting that, indeed, narrative interpretation has proven useful to people because it's a way of just not perhaps restricting musical understanding to purely formalist criteria like form or key structure, or indeed reductively emotive accounts of musical significance. This music makes me feel this, therefore that's the entire sense of it. He says that, and he moves on now to about page 467 or so, that musical narratology in the modern sense really develops in the 1970s, and he refers to Edward Cohen's book, The Composer's Voice, published in 1974. He says an interesting book that made a lot of people stop and think. But he says it's typical that perhaps Cohen didn't really go back to that publication and extend it through a series of additional publications dealing with the same kind of topic. So he says really there's perhaps a piecemeal phase where people tried their hand at interpreting music as narrative, and this was then succeeded in the 1990s by really a set of sceptical responses. Now we've seen one of those by and large from Nattier, and that was published in 1990. Morse also says, yes, people understood that to be what Caroline Abate was saying in 1991. She also was questioning of music's narrative substance, narrative purpose, or narrative significance. And also he names another author, Peter Kivy, in 1993, who also questioned music's narrative status. So here now is the first question. So having questioned the motivation, or noting that people have done this, for discussing any productive reappraisal of the status of musical narrative based on issues such as having declared that it has no past tense, for example, which temporal dimension does Morse identify as appropriate for the way in which listeners imagine the events in a musical plot? So he says, yeah, when they imagine a musical plot, they do invoke time. Which temporal aspect does he think is appropriate? Question 2. Although music relies on repetition far more than linguistic expression ever does, Morse says, does he regard this as disqualifying a claim to narrative status for music? Does he say that because music relies so much on literal repetition, whereas language does not, therefore does music's narrative status simply fall apart? Question 3. Does Morse believe that music possesses the capacity for agency and action in a way that is meaningful for listeners? Does it have agents? Does music seem to move in a way that those agents accrue meanings and significance? So we'll move on a little bit. Having considered these assumptions, Morse then proceeds to look at the way in which a music theorist such as Marian Guck, so this is in the next section of the article, she teaches at University of Michigan, Marian Guck, has chosen to narrativize, there's Nattier's word, her musical understanding by employing a sense of agency and action in opposition to the formalist mode of discourse employed by a theorist, composer theorist such as Milton Babbitt. Here's question 4. What word does Guck associate with the alien note C flat in the slow movement of Mozart's G minor symphony, K550? Now this is the passage after measure 53. At first she uses one word, which is portentous. What's the other word she uses to describe that odd C flat note? In the next phase of the essay, Morse explores the way in which commentators such as Joseph Kerman and Susan McClary have been drawn to the concerto as a staging of the relationship between an individual and the collective. McClary's 1986 article in particular is examined for the way in which she reads the slow movement of Mozart's Piano Concerto in G, K453, against a threefold drama involving secular, sacred, and conflicted social dimensions. So here are the last two questions, and that's where this video will come to a stop, but here's question 5. By way of a provisional conclusion, Maus compares the approaches taken by Gluck and McClary. If Gluck's narrative sense is dependent on a listening experience, does McClary explicitly expect readers to share in her auditory sense of the piece? So Gluck is saying, I hear the piece in this way. Does McClary say, I hear the piece in this way? Question 6. What is the related concept that Maus then proceeds to characterise with respect to Anthony Newcomb's sense of the multi-movement design in Schumann's Second Symphony? So in the next section of the essay, he looks at the work of Anthony Newcomb. There's a specific word that, or a phrase, two-word phrase that Newcomb applies to Schumann's Second Symphony to get the sense of its multi-movement design and the way that moves through time. What is the two-word phrase? Okay, I'm going to stop this first video and I'll move on to the second one, which will be shorter. Okay, bye for now.